Nintendo's 8-bit consoles don't have enough video memory to keep track of an entire screen of pixels. So how is it possible for them to display those classic Nintendo graphics? Well, today we're going to find out as we continue our exploration of the Famicom. This is episode 5 in my series called Inside the Famicom. If you've been following along with me so far in this series, then you've become familiar with the overall architecture of the Famicom and the NES, and you've gotten acquainted with the CPU and its memory architecture. In the last episode, I started exploring the picture processing unit by taking a look at how that chip functions. And in this video, I'm picking up where I left off and exploring the remaining aspects of the Famicom's display architecture. And there's no doubt that Nintendo did something right in that department. Many of their games had great graphics for the time period. But unlike modern systems, the Famicom didn't have a massive color palette. It could only display 64 unique colors. Well, sort of. You see, there's 64 colors hard-coded into the picture processing unit's palette memory, but a few of them are duplicates, and there's one color you can't use because it's outside the video signal specs and might screw up the picture. So with all that in mind, there's really only 56 unique colors. Now, because these colors are hard-coded into the PPU, you can't change them. But there is a way to modify the tinting of each color, and that changes the amount of emphasis that's put on the red, green, or blue that comprise that color. So when you take into account all these different tints, the Famicom developer had 448 different colors to use. So we should be seeing some pretty amazing graphics in Famicom games, right? Well, even though all these different colors were available, the number of colors that could be displayed on the screen was actually limited by the amount of palette RAM inside the PPU. Here's how it works. There's 32 bytes of memory at address 3F00 to reference colors that are drawn to the screen. This memory is divided into two segments. The first 16 bytes are for the background graphics, which are called patterns, and the other 16 bytes are used for the colors and sprites. On top of that, each of these segments is further divided into 4 separate color palettes, each containing 4 colors. Background tiles and sprites get to select which of these 4 color palettes to use. Even though there's 4 colors in each palette, only 3 of them are unique. The first color is a common color that's shared among each palette. This is called the backdrop color, and it's used for sprite transparency. Any pixels in a sprite that are painted this color are transparent, so you'll see either the background or another sprite behind it. Now, the Famicom, and pretty much every console, needs to keep track of which graphics should be drawn to the screen. This is done with a RAM chip that's dedicated to this purpose called Video RAM, or VRAM for short, which is labeled U4 on the board. When the PPU forms the video signal that's displayed on the TV, it uses the data in VRAM as the source for where graphical elements should go. But back in the early 80s, memory cost a lot of money. So this VRAM chip, which is tiny by today's standards, comes in at just 2 kilobytes in size. Now, the display resolution of the Famicom is 256 pixels wide by 240 pixels high. So there are 61,440 pixels drawn on the screen. If you only used 1 bit to represent each pixel, then you'd need almost 8 kilobytes of memory to keep track of this pixel data. And that's only with a black and white image. If you wanted to use 64 colors, then you'd need 6 bits per pixel, and that would require nearly 46 kilobytes of VRAM. But how is it that the Famicom can keep track of all of its pixels on only 2 kilobytes of memory? Well, Nintendo uses a clever technique that was actually used by many arcade machines at the time. It would group sets of repeating pixels together into patterns that are 8 pixels wide and 8 pixels high. Some of these patterns are assembled together in a grid to form the background image, and we call those the background tiles. Other patterns are used to form the sprites that move around on the screen. All of these patterns are kept together in a table, which is aptly called the pattern table, and that's stored on the game cartridge. By using patterns, the console doesn't need to keep track of each individual pixel on the screen. All it needs to know is which patterns are displayed on the screen and in which order. And for something like that, 2 kilobytes of VRAM is more than enough. The area in VRAM where the pattern layout's kept also has a name. Nintendo calls it a name table. One name table is equivalent to one screen full of background tiles, and each name table takes up 1 kilobyte of memory. The first 960 bytes reference the background tile that should be displayed, starting at the upper left corner and painting horizontally down to the lower right corner. Because there's 32 background tiles in each row and 30 rows of tiles, there's 960 total background tiles on the screen. Each tile is represented in the name table with a single byte. This 1 byte value corresponds to a background tile in the pattern table. So looking at this example from Adventure Island 2, you can see that the name table acts as a pointer to a tile address. After the background tile data, the next 64 bytes contains the attribute table, and the way this works is a little bit odd. The attribute table groups tiles into sets of 4. You can visualize this by overlaying a grid on top of the screen. Each cluster of 4 background tiles is assigned to the same 4-color palette. So as a result, each 16 by 16 pixel segment will use the same 4 colors. And since there's only 240 of these segments on the screen, and you only need 2 bits to select the color palette, the palettes for all the background tiles only use 60 bytes of memory. But Ken, you said the attribute table consumes 64 bytes, not 60. Well, that's right. Those other 4 bytes pertain to rows of tiles that don't really exist in the name table. So those lost bytes are ignored because they don't contain anything meaningful. If you were following along closely earlier, then you would have noticed that I said that the VRAM chip has 2 kilobytes of memory. But the name table is only 1 kilobyte. So what's in that other 1K of memory in the VRAM chip? Well, it's another name table. VRAM can hold 2 name tables, which gives it 2 full screens full of background tiles directly in memory. One name table will be the screen currently being displayed, and the other name table will be the next screen that comes into view when the game scrolls. For games like Super Mario Bros., the screen scrolls horizontally, so the second name table will contain the tiles for the next screen to the right of the one that's currently being displayed. To smoothly scroll the background, the PPU displays a 256 by 240 pixel window into these 2 name tables. The position of this viewable area is controlled by an 8-bit PPU register called PPU scroll. So when Mario moves towards the middle of the screen, this register gets incremented and this screen scrolls appropriately. And this works the same way for games like 1942, where the screen scrolls vertically. Except in those cases, the second name table contains the screen either above or below the one that the player sees on the TV. And rather than changing the X position of the viewable area in PPU scroll, the game changes its Y position. In early Famicom cartridges, the scrolling direction was actually set by a physical connection on the cartridge PCB. For example, here's the PCB for the game Spartan X. Here you can see 2 sets of pads, one labeled H and the other labeled V, and the H pad is bridged with a blob of solder. Spartan X is a horizontally scrolling game, but that's not exactly what these connections mean. Instead, they determine which PPU address line is connected to address line A10 on the VRAM chip. To understand this, let's go ahead and remove the solder blob from Spartan X. If you look at the Famicom schematic, you'll notice that address pin A10 on the VRAM chip connects to pin 18 on the cartridge slot. And if you trace pin 18 on the cartridge, you'll see that it connects to this middle signal between the H and the V pads. So when you bridge one of these connections with solder, it connects either H or V to VRAM address pin 10 through pin 18 of the cartridge connector. The other side of the H-pad is connected to pin 53 on the cartridge slot, and that's wired into address line 10 on the PPU. And V is connected to pin 54, which is wired into PPU address line 11. So depending on which of these connections are bridged, either PPU address line 10 or 11 will be connected into VRAM address pin A10. This all results in some interesting behavior. Let's go back to our two name tables and we'll label them. We'll call them A and B. Nametable A sits at PPU address 2000 and nametable B is at address 2400. And let's suppose that we have a game like Spartan X where the H-pad is bridged on the cartridge. Because of that, PPU address pin 10 is connected to VRAM address pin 10. Now suppose that we want to read the data from nametable A. The PPU will set the address bus to 2000 by putting a logic high on address line 13 and keeping the other address lines low. Remember that VRAM is only 2 kilobytes in size, so it only has 11 address lines. Even though the PPU is requesting data at 2000, VRAM only sees the bottom 11 bits of that address. So from VRAM's perspective, the PPU is requesting data at address 000, and that's what it provides back. Let's go back to our nametable diagram and clarify this distinction by adding in the address from both the PPU's perspective and from VRAM's perspective. Now let's read from nametable B. This time, the PPU puts address 2400 on the bus, and the VRAM chip only sees the bottom 11 bits of the address, so it responds with the data at 400. So far so good. We can read from both nametables in memory. But you may recall from the last episode that I mentioned that the address space for VRAM is 4 kilobytes in size, and so far we've only been reading the first 2 kilobytes from addresses 2000 through 27FF. But what would happen if we tried to read the second half of the address space by reading data at address 2800? Well, since we have the H-pad connected on the cartridge, address pin A11 isn't connected to VRAM, and therefore it's completely ignored. So from the PPU's perspective, it's requesting data at 2800, but from VRAM's perspective, the PPU is asking for data at 000. And because of this, from the PPU's perspective, this introduces a third nametable, which we'll call nametable C, and it looks exactly like nametable A. And if the PPU were to read from address to C00, the exact same thing would happen, but this time, VRAM would give it the contents of nametable B. So what Nintendo has effectively done here is provided 4 nametables, with 2 of them being duplicates of the other 2. So in this configuration with the H-pad connected on the cartridge, you would say that the nametables are mirrored vertically, since the mirrors are stacked on top of one another. But what would happen if the V-pad on the cartridge were connected instead? Well, if the PPU were to request data for nametable B from address 2400, then from the VRAM's perspective, it looks like the request is coming in for the data at 000. And this is because address pin 10 on VRAM is now connected to PPU address line 11, and so PPU address line 10 is completely ignored. As a result, a request for data at 2400 will return the contents of nametable A. And if the PPU were to instead request data at address 2800, then VRAM sees it as a request for address 400 and gives it the contents of nametable B. So by connecting the V-pad on the cartridge, we've swapped the nametables at 2 of the addresses. And what this now results in is the 2 nametables are stacked up on top of one another and mirrored horizontally. So this design is how Nintendo was able to get such a great visual experience out of a meager 2 kilobytes of video memory. What I walk you through today is a general explanation of how this all works. But as with any technology, developers find unique ways to stretch the capabilities of a system. For example, there's a way to manipulate PPU registers to show all 448 colors on the screen at the same time. And this is shown in the infamous full palette demo. We'll take a look at some of these tricks in a later episode when I talk about cartridge design and we start to dive into the memory mapper chips. But that's all the time I have for this episode. Up next in episode 6, we'll talk about the audio architecture, so stay tuned for that, and consider subscribing so you don't miss it when it comes online. Alright, I'll see you next time, but as always, until then, go make something cool.